Morning and welcome to the annual conference, day 3. It's Friday morning, so I guess if you're in the East Coast, it'll be good afternoon. If you're not, probably good morning. We have with us here today Michelle Weise, who actually spoke with us before at one of our first summits for online leadership, and we're happy to be welcoming her back to the annual conference in her new role with Strada. And we're going to be talking to her about the kinds of issues that we'll be talking about, or that you'll be talking about in your session later today that closes out our 104th annual conference. I'm Bob Hansen. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of UPCEA, and I'd like to introduce Michelle. We'll be looking at you because it's easier for you to see us rather than looking at each other, even though we're right next to each other.
A little awkward.
Yes. So Michelle.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm Michelle Weise. I'm from Strada Education Network. I lead the Institute for the Future of Work. And you all, and don't be weirded out by the fact that Bob and I aren't going to look at each other. I will try to look at you, and that way we can also answer your questions as well. But looking forward to chatting.
So Michelle, one of the reasons we are excited about having you speak today with the virtual audience, but also our physical audience later this morning, is because you've had just such an interesting professional trajectory. The first time I knew of you, you were still working at the Christensen Institute, which, as many of you in the audience know, was such a powerful force in higher education because it coined the term disruption theory or popularized it. And I think that it's kind of interesting because it was describing a phenomenon that the Christian Institute had identified, but the mere fact of identifying that phenomenon itself became a kind of disruption, which I didn't even think about until I was preparing for the interview today. And then after that, you went to Southern New Hampshire University, which is a very innovative institution, and working in its office called the Sandbox, and now Strada. So could you share with us a little bit about, what drives you and how did you get started on this path? What were you doing before Christensen Institute, and what got you involved in this kind of innovation space and disruption theory and et cetera?
So, yeah, it's funny because when I was working for the Christensen Institute and giving talks about the theories of disruption, people just sort of assumed that I had an MBA or came from a business background or had a PhD in business. But actually, my PhD is in English literature.
Me too. I didn't know that.
Really?
Yes.
So I was actually a college professor for a while, and I had a wonderful, amazing kind of tenure track trajectory that I was on. But through that work, I just sort of realized that I was lucky enough to get a job right before the Great Recession. And in that wonderful job I had, I also saw the limits of the kinds of students that I might be able to touch and impact. So that's where I started to see the limitations of what I was doing in that particular context. And it's not like when you're a professor, you can just say, I want to go work with a more diverse student population. I want to go teach here. That's just not how the job market works when it's so oversaturated. Right. So for me, it was a big decision to kind of get out of academia. And I knew once I made that decision, I wasn't going to be able to come back necessarily. So I was lucky enough to kind of move out of that role and find work as the Vice President of Academic Affairs for an EdTech startup that was helping military service members transition into civilian careers. And that's actually where I really kind of found my calling and sort of understanding what it means to be working for a mission-driven organization and to be just absolutely 100% dedicated to helping people get better information so that they can make better decisions about their pathways. And that's kind of what has been really the core theme, even though I've kind of moved around in different ways throughout my career in a way that I would not have been able to map out on the front end. But that has really been the sort of core piece of all of my work, where I'm very concerned and motivated by how difficult transitions are to maneuver in whether it's, when you're making a decision to go into college, whether it's that first job. And then for now, in particular, at Strada Institute for the Future of Work, we're especially concerned about the kinds of transitions that adult learners are going to have to make throughout their work lives, just as the future of work becomes more turbulent for all of us. So that's kind of been what is motivating me in all of the work that I do.
Well, so I want to in a parking lot. I want to come back there near the end and talk to you a little about the future of work as a concept. It seems to be taking off. The phrase "future of work" seems to be taking off at this very same time as alternative credentials have been as well, and they're in some ways, I guess, opposite sides of the same coin, or one would like to think it's the same coin. And I'd love to hear what your reflections are on the degree to which higher ed has been nimble enough or not in addressing that. So let's not forget that. But so has your thinking evolved? I imagine, of course, it has, because you're a smart woman. So has your in what ways has your thinking evolved? That's a better way to frame it. Since disruption theory, which took the world by storm, probably, or at least it took my world as UPCEA CEO by storm, and from 2011 to 2013, 14. In what ways has your thinking evolved since then?
So there's a couple of things going on. First, the theory of disruptive innovation can really be polarizing in a lot of different circumstances, and often I find it's mostly because people have an incorrect definition of what it is. And so a lot of our work when I was at the Christensen Institute, and what it when it persistently is today, is clarifying and helping people understand what are the markers of disruption that you really need to think about. The fascinating thing, when I moved from the Christensen Institute to Southern New Hampshire University, I really wanted to see how the theories really did turn into practice, because Paul LeBlanc really does take the theories seriously, had Clay on his board, and we always which sort of as an institution that did really great work. So I wanted to see what it was like on the ground. And the amazing thing about the Innovators Dilemma is that it is persistent. It is relentless. So when you are in the work of trying to affect change or innovation from within, it's not like some moment that you try to reach and you're set. It is constant and it is difficult. And so even at some
mode of being, right? Rather than,
it's not a one and done kind of thing. Yeah. And so that's the thing is, even at the most innovative institutions, if you go to any of the sort of leading online education, competency-based groups, any kind of forward-thinking institution, you will hear the sort of same thing come up, which is that it is hard. It is hard to do this work, to do this kind of radical transformation from within. And so it is real. Like what I was, in terms of sort of my evolution of thinking, is it was sort of confirmation of how difficult it is to move in an environment in which inertia kind of tends to reign.
Would it be an oversimplification to say that you moved from theory to practice, understand that it's a Venn diagram probably, and there's a bit of overlap anyway, but would that be an oversimplification, or is that a helpful way to state it?
I think what I found most helpful about the theories is that it's as soon as, especially from, I imagine a lot of the folks on this call are coming from an institutional perspective. And it's when you're looking at something on the periphery that seems to be doing something interesting or that people are touting as innovative. And if there is a moment at which you kind of want to dismiss it and sort of say, yeah, but that doesn't really affect what it is that I'm doing on my campus, or that's like a lower grade version of what it is that students really need. I know what students need, and that's not quite it. It's at that moment that I think it's particularly helpful to bring in the theories, because it helps us identify that moment as, wait, why am I potentially denigrating or scorning that thing? Because let me just analyze it and see whether it might be fitting into some of these markers that need to exist for something to be called disruptive. And that's what I found most helpful, is anytime you kind of just have that impulse to squash something or just dismiss it, that's actually when you need to pay attention. And so that's what I find really valuable. It's interesting. I heard someone yesterday at another event talk about how you see all these kind of coding boot camps that were the rage. Some of them folding, some of them getting acquired, and people. One speaker I listened to said, "Well, I think what we're seeing is that the coding bootcamp rage is maturing, and it's not going to grow anymore. I think there's, with anytime you're talking about things that look disruptive, when you see something happening, there's this tendency to say, aha, see, it's not working, status quo, like we've been doing this for hundreds of years, we're going to be fine. But I think that is a mistake where, at this moment we have like a huge marketplace burgeoning, tapping into these vulnerabilities.
Just an analogous example, and MOOCs. So I remember when MOOCs was, it was the year of the MOOC, and many of us who'd been in the industry for a long time and have been leaders of online were frustrated by it, because it's like, who are these Johnny-come-latelys about MOOCs? And it doesn't add up to anything. They're free. Nobody completes it, and how silly that is. And gee, we know what we're doing because we do degree programs and online. We've been doing it for 2 decades. And so people thought, I think they wrote off MOOCs as a false disruptive moment. But then you started to see, to your point, people like Georgia, institutions like Georgia Tech, taking the lessons from MOOC to scale up in very affordable graduate degree programs, particularly in their IT programs. So I think that does that capture kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Is that anything that starts at sort of the end of the market that is not necessarily being attended to has the possibility of evolving and becoming more sophisticated over time. So, when MOOCs were all the rage, that's actually when I was at the Christensen Institute, we were very clear in saying this is not disruptive, because they hadn't figured out their business model. They had, there were certain things that they were missing. But there's nothing that says they can't evolve to understand how important the role of employers are. And you see that actually now with a bunch of them moving toward more deliberate partnerships with employers. You see them trying to move toward this idea of a stackable credential. So there is the possibility there. What I think we should all thank MOOCs for is the way in which it has legitimized, that movement has legitimized online education, by having some of these top tier institutions buy into it. That was huge for the field.
Yeah, it was sort of the mainstreamification of what had been a more marginal enterprise. Frustratingly so, it was on the margins, but it was. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now. What's driving your research and work in general at the Institute for the Future of Work?
Yeah, so I started this lab, which is focused 100% on the future of work, to understand what all these projections mean. That this is a very much trending conversation going on, but there's also a lot of noise. There was at the time a lot of different descriptions of what the skills gap was or wasn't. Were we in a stage of wage stagnation, or was it under and unemployment issues? And so the idea is to get a little bit clear and synthesize some of the best thinking out there to help us understand how learning will have to transform to meet the needs of that workforce of 2030 or 2040. And so in our research, we really hope to identify a lot of holes in the marketplace that exist today that need to be filled, and seeds of innovation that need to be scaled to create what we call a learning ecosystem of the future. If we kind of buy into the fact that technology is rapidly changing the nature of work, and also that our work lives might potentially become a little bit longer and more turbulent, then we're going to have to figure out a way to create the right sorts of systems and the infrastructure and the architecture to facilitate more seamless movements in and out of learning and work. And so that is the crux of all of our research.
So, yes, as you know, a lot of UPCEA member institutions, I mentioned Georgia Tech, but there's 380 institutions represented, probably close to that at this institution or this conference, and many of them are really at the forefront of much of what you champion: alternative credentials, stackables, and other varied pathways, including employer connections. Obviously, future work implies employer connections as well. What do you see as the most exciting development right now on the horizon, and to what extent do you think that our members, divisions of continuing education and professional studies and global campuses, do you think that they're beginning to meet that need, and where are they failing? What are the remaining obstacles?
So I think one of the most wonderful things about colleges that have continuing ed and professional education programs is that often it's those offices that are doing some of the most innovative work and always kind of on the leading edge of thinking about how to help adult learners kind of transition and upskill. I think the challenge that a lot of institutions will face and will continue to face is that many of them don't have precise business models oriented around how difficult it is to be an adult learner, right? We tend to sort of still invite them onto campus or involve them in synchronous activities, which really get in the way of all of their own lives that get in the way of their pursuit of an educational credential. So I think we are going to the opportunity ahead is really thinking deliberately about how we meet learners really where they are and instead of trying to ask them to add learning experiences on top of everything they have going on in life. Are there ways in which these institutions and employer partners can rethink something like on-the-job training so that it's integrated into their workforce and their in their work? So I think that's one of the key pieces we see as critical. And the other piece that is not getting as much attention right now is how we attend to the bottom quartile of our American population who have a high school degree, who are out of the system or are barely making it in the system, where they're earning, approximately $35,000 per year. They do not have an associate degree. There are 44 million working age adults who kind of fall into that bucket, who are really at risk of being left behind by the future of work. And so that really needs to be core to our thinking about how we attend to adults in the future, is how do we bring these folks into the system and make sure they're uplifted along the way so that in the future they can have that opportunity to retool themselves for the future.
Let's talk about institutional inertia, for want of a better word. I think when I was in the field at a regional public, and certainly this is still the case at so many of our institutions, until probably 2 or 3 years ago, almost all of our folks worked at the margins of their institutions still. And that's really beginning to change, as I think that the strategic imperative of serving what is now a new majority, essentially, learner, about 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5, depending on what stats you're looking at, of students today are not residential, full-time, first-time. They're the folks that our members have been serving for 100 years. How much are you seeing that, to me, self-evident strategic imperative actually leading towards an institutional recognition, not just the recognition of the dean of professional studies or associate provost for distance learning, but more broadly, how much are you seeing institutions grapple with that mandate to really pivot? And institutions are not quick to pivot, in part because of shared governance and faculty resistance to some of the things that would require.
Yeah.
And before you answer that, let me just say, what I find really fascinating is we looked at new members at UPCEA in the last year, and for the first time, a minority of our new member traditional continuing education, 30%, 38% are coming from the pure online space. 8% are provosts, which is fascinating. 8% have innovation in their title. Another 12% have graduate studies or marketing and enrollment management. So you that is evidence, it seems to me, of a pivoting. How fast is that pivoting happening, and what are you seeing?
So I don't know if we could use the word fast.
Yeah, I wouldn't use fast either. But
the challenge is anyone who has innovation in their title knows the sort of depth of those challenges. There is so much inertia in the system, and the reason that is incentives, even if it makes complete sense to be pivoting and thinking about an adult learner population, if the institution is not focused in that way, because they are the new traditional student, even if it makes complete sense, none of the incentives that we have are aligned with that business model. Even our federal funding systems are geared toward more well-educated learners who are to help them along in the process. There's not a lot, again, geared toward those 44 million who could really use the most help in moving along. So it's not just academic inertia. It's partly just the incentives that do not align. There are certain federal and policy implications that are guiding the mechanisms at work.
It's also promotion and tenure.
Yep.
So one of our 6 recommendations that for higher education, you remain relevant, sustainable, and innovative. By 2025, we announced it on Wednesday. One of the 6 recommendations is to reward faculty for being successful in meeting student needs, institutional needs, and employer needs. That's a sea change, and of course, that's a long arc. That's going to be difficult to do, but I think that would be helpful, particularly for regional publics and privates.
Yeah. I mean, even if you think of like something very simple, which is we know that employers want nimble thinkers, people who are agile, who can adapt to new and ambiguous circumstances, and show judgment as well. That requires thinking about scaffolding learning differently than we currently have it structured. If we think about all of our departmental silos and the way that people are promoted and rewarded for the kinds of activities that they do, they are not rewarded for that transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary work. In fact, if you co-teach in certain instances, that's looked down upon, right, for your promotion process. It's not the same as teaching your own course, whereas what we should be teaching our learners is how they actually translate a concept over here across instead of just understanding how you solve a problem in this particular silo. But again, that's just a very small instantiation of how difficult it is to change things. But that is what is helpful about sort of as you think about the theories of disruption is the reason why it is so difficult to change within an organization is that it's extraordinarily difficult to figure out a revenue model for even a nonprofit institution. You have to put resources into play. You have to put processes into play. All of that kind of moves into, you have a value proposition as well, right? That those resources and processes are trying to put into play. And you, over a certain amount of iterations, you start to develop some way of creating revenue. What happens though is that business model ends up locking you in to what you can or cannot deliver. It's very difficult to move out of that one phase. So even if you see the innovation and promise of something on the horizon, it's not easy to kind of bring that in and just sort of execute it. The whole system is set up so that innovating and promising model will actually get completely turned into mush as you try to make it work within your own system, within that existing system. So that's where innovation gets really difficult.
That is very, very thoughtful response. We have a question here. Or do we? Are you asking for questions?
No, we have one.
Great. There you go, Michelle.
Okay, so
You might want to ask what it is.
It says, can you speak to what we need to do? Oh, sorry, I can't remember.
More to embrace competency-based education to do a better job of helping students document KSAs to be more successful in the world of work.
Oh, okay, Kelvin. So the CBE, right, is also kind of like the MOOCs went through a period of just real excitement and then you've seen it you see less in the press about, especially online CBE. The challenge that I've seen I believe still in the real disruptive potential of competency-based education. The problem and the challenge is that the way it has currently been deployed with the approximately 600 institutions dabbling in this is that everyone still is trying to make this new, interesting model fit into the credit hour system, right? We keep trying to plug it into, because we need federal financial aid, we keep trying to plug it into this old socket. And what that does is it removes that disruptive potential, because the whole promise of CBE is that you can modularize learning in ways that can keep up with the workforce. But we keep trying to turn them into degree programs. And that's where sort of the most interesting thinkers on CBE will really think about how do I think about this more as clusters of competencies that are aligned to the workforce, and really modularization piece. And part of the challenge is our financial system, right? Like the way that we finance that learning is often through federal financial aid.
Yes.
So that's where the promise of something like income share agreements, those sorts of things,
well, maybe in substantive interaction.
It's a problem,
You know, that is a challenge. And
Yeah.
if you really believe the premise that it's only about competencies, what does regular and substantive interaction have to do with that whatsoever? If one can demonstrate the competencies, doesn't matter how you get them.
And the challenge is, right, I think people can kind of buy this idea of mastery-based learning, but the problem is most of our institutions are not collaborating with one another. They keep trying to develop their own set of competencies as if they were some sort of secret sauce.
Yeah.
And so we have no taxonomy that makes sense across the board. Again, we have like 600 institutions creating 600 different taxonomies of CBE, where we don't have any kind of alignment or standardization of some of those broader taxonomies that we all know learners need.
I think it's that absence of the Ministry of Education that some other countries have, right? They'd make that happen. But it is really the strength of our country that we do have so many different models. Are there any other questions? Okay, while you're thinking out there in the ether, any other thoughts you'd like to share, Michelle?
Yeah, one of the things that I just wanted to offer up to the folks on the call is to do this intense work with adult learners, and especially as you all are thinking about learning experiences that don't necessarily always lead to a specific credential, but do involve this idea of helping people transition into new and more better jobs. So we are actually going to be doing some work where we're going to be building a really vast repository of adult learner voices. I think kind of the Humans of New York project, where we get to sort of uplift the idea of the adult learner. You think about kind of how ridiculous the notion is of a non-traditional learner. Adult learner is not really any better because it's such a monolithic category. Yeah. So we're trying to demystify that learner voice and add some more nuance to it. So if any of the folks on the call are leading institutions that would like to be involved, we'd love to get your learner voices on that platform. And so that's a fun project that we're building over the course of the next year.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Sure. Who's doing a good job of managing all the different types of digital credentials. One of the more promising things that at least I've seen is some of the work going on with Badger pathways, where they are trying to understand how, because to date, the idea of a stackable credential is still somewhat mythical. I don't see a whole lot of institutions doing this with great success. We like the idea of packaging smaller bites of learning that could lead up to a degree, but there right now it's a little bit more of talk, and there's not a whole lot of folks who are actually earning degrees in that way. But the exciting thing about because there was all this excitement also about badges. Badges are problematic because they're most often developed on the supply side, and employers have no idea what to make of those badges. But you see some of the innovation going on with the pathways work, trying to help connect how all those things do add up to something meaningful to an employer. So that's something that I think is quite exciting.
Okay, great.
Okay. Those are all the questions.
That's all the questions. Good.
One more. What are some of the trends and signals you are seeing about the future of learning specific digital literacies that will be needed by all workers? What are the soft skills that will be needed? Yeah, so this is actually going to be the topic of my talk in a little bit, which is the literature on the future of work is pretty it's pretty clear. They keep kind of the recurring theme, whether you're looking at the World Economic Forum or another major report, is that people keep talking about our resistance to automation. We see a tremendous amount of automation occurring now, and that will continue to occur at exponential rates. So the one thing we need to focus on, therefore, in, as stated in the literature, is we need to figure out how we leverage our uniquely human skills for that future of work, so that we can bring something to bear in coordinating better with the robots. And so people then tend to think, okay, so then that means we got to focus on soft skills. The problem with talking about soft skills is that you immediately kind of uplift this dichotomy between soft and hard skills. And in our report that's called Robot Ready Human Plus Skills for the Future of Work, we talk about how that's less of a useful less of a useful mindset, because it really is both and. Human skills alone are not going to be enough to keep us ahead of the robots. We actually have to have these kind of human plus skills. And the way in which we actually see this deployed, and we used the data from our affiliate MZ, a labor market data analytics company, to look at how job postings data is actually marrying up with social profile and resume data. And you can actually see the way in which people deploy those very broad human skills like communication, problem solving, critical thinking, how that actually manifests in the workforce. And it does actually manifest in these ways that show how hybrid these skills are. They're both soft and hard. It's that human plus technical. So that's what we kind of try to lay out in that particular report.
I want to read that report. That sounds fascinating. It sounds like something that shows like must reading in our field, and must reading actually for the nation, because I do think, you go into order your lunch now, or you go into CVS, and you rarely have to transact with a person. And at first it was disconcerting, and now it's just time saving. You're right. Well, I think we're wrapping up now, and I wanted to thank Shindig for their partnership here and helping us do these virtual interviews. Have been very, very helpful. Appreciate that. Now, the final question is really important, which is, what was your doctoral focus on in English?
It was very relevant to our conversation today. It was on Asian American fiction and poetry.
Excellent. Amy Tan and those folks.
Right.
Terrific. Mine was in postmodern American lit. And in fact, it's so funny because so many of the people I know in really the adult learning space and the online space come from the field of English. I don't know why that is, but John O'Brien, who's my counterpart at EduCause, you'd think he'd come from the IT world. No, he's a PhD in lit. So
I will actually connect it to our experience and background in literature, which is that one of the core skills that will be needed for the future of work is emotional intelligence and empathy. That is something that a robot or a computer will just simply not be able to do. And one of the things that's incredible about something like literature, and really that literature only can do, is the ability to leverage something that's called free and direct discourse, where when you're reading a narrative, you can actually get into the mind of someone else. There's sort of no other kind of thing that you can do where you literally can stand in someone else's shoes and understand the kinds of decisions that someone is going to make. And the critic Saul Morrison over at Northwestern has written extensively about this. But I think that is something really powerful to think about, particularly because right now we are seeing a decline in people majoring in the liberal arts. And if this is one of the chief cultivators of some of these uniquely human skills for the future, this is just something that we do need to take note of, is how do we then make sure that we are being deliberate about how we cultivate those human skills along the way.
The employers, notwithstanding your very astute comments earlier about hard and soft skills, the employers continue to tell us that communication is the skill they value as much or more than anything other than team building, which is the other thing they mentioned. But even the graduates of some of the best institutions in the country don't know how to write well coming out of those institutions or to communicate well. So thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully next time you'll join us live at our annual conference in Boston or at our summit for online leadership and administration in New Orleans, or at one of our regional conferences in the fall. So thank you, Michelle, for agreeing to participate in this Shindig sponsored interview. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks all.
Have a good day, everybody.
Okay.